America are women. And 1 out of 3 jobs held by women in our country has been classified as essential. So this is an issue that affects all of us, young and old, every kind.
Yes, that does appear to be a video of Joe Biden nodding off while on a live stream with Hillary Clinton. It's actually incredible that we are at a point where his obvious mental decline is not front page news. You'd think that the front runner for the Democratic nominee for President of the United States being unable to stay awake on his own program would be newsworthy. But if we go to the news tab on Google, there's nothing about it. No publication seems to think that it is worth covering that the Democratic primary nominee is unable to stay awake during their own broadcast and is unable to, basically mentally function. And even while Joe Biden is unable to string together complete sentences at time, you still have him winning the Ohio primary. And while I understand that every single candidate at this point has suspended their campaign, you would think that perhaps the electorate, the Democrat electorate, would educate themselves and find information that shows that this man is clearly not mentally capable of running for president. Not even just being president, but running for president, and try to do something about it. Vote, Instead, they actually allow a man who is visibly senile to continue running. But as you can guess from the title of this video, this isn't about Joe Biden's melted brain, but more about how the media has covered his accusations of sexual assault versus the accusations of sexual assault that were levied against Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. And yes, I'm going to be using a Fox News article because this Fox News article is good. It has a pretty decent comparison between how media outlets were acting over the days and weeks that they were covering this story. On day 1 of the Kavanaugh coverage, the New York Times published a story in which they said that the Kavanaugh nomination was in turmoil. CNN also released a slew of articles, some of which were just reporting that reports were out, others of which were more opinions, like likening it to the Anita Hill testimony in the 90s. Unlike the Kavanaugh accusations, which were posted originally in the Washington Post and quickly picked up by mainstream outlets like the New York Times and CNN, Tara Reade's accusations against Joe Biden were first released on a podcast hosted by Katie Halper, who is a Rolling Stones journalist and podcast host. In the interview, Tara Reade says she told her brother, her mother, and a friend about the incident at the time, and while her mother has passed away, both the friend and her brother confirmed Reade's account in an interview with The Intercept. Now, this is dated March 25th, 2020. But the article with The Intercept, in which a media outlet actually follows up with the people that Tara Reade says can corroborate her accounts, the article is dated April 24th, a full month later. On the very same day, CNN and the New York Times, unsurprisingly, publish anti-Bernie articles basically trying to get him to drop out and let Biden take the nominee. Tara Reade's claims don't appear on air or online at CNN, and they do not appear anywhere in the New York Times on the same day. Just to recap, during the Kavanaugh accusations, CNN and the New York Times picked up on it the same day, while in the case of the Biden accusations, it was not mentioned at all. I'm going to start picking up the pace here, but on day 2 of the Kavanaugh incident, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer calls for an FBI background investigation into the claims against Kavanaugh. Quote, "We need the FBI to step forward to ensure that the Senate and American public have complete information about this troubling alleged incident before a hearing is held, Schumer says. CNN calls Ford's accusation a watershed moment for the GOP, and the Huffington Post runs a story quoting Biden as saying, "Women's claims of sexual assault should be presumed to be true. For a woman to come forward in the glaring lights of focus nationally, you've got to start off with the presumption that at least the essence of what she's talking about is real, whether or not she forgets facts, whether or not it's been made worse or better over time, but nobody fails to understand that this is like jumping into a cauldron." Meanwhile, the day after Joe Biden is accused of sexual assault, Jimmy Kimmel interviews him in a rather lighthearted tone. Schumer, who said an FBI investigation needs to be brought up for the American people to have complete information when making a decision, touts the Green New Deal, and CNN teases an upcoming town hall with Joe Biden in 3 days after Kavanaugh was accused of sexual assault. CNN had said that the confirmation process had descended into chaos, and the New York Times published an op-ed from Anita Hill which argued that heightened awareness of sexual violence comes heightened accountability for our representatives. And a Democratic senator from Hawaii, Mazie Hirono, said all men should shut up. And 3 days after Biden was accused, CNN's Anderson Cooper does not ask Biden about Reid's claims in a lengthy virtual town hall. In a write-up for the event, CNN assures readers, Joe Biden, he's just like the rest of us, falling asleep listening to Hillary Clinton. The Huffington Post finally picks up the stories 3 days later and notes that Reid was one of 8 women to accuse the former vice president of inappropriate touching. But the article also goes on and says that Reid was accused of being politically motivated and called a Russian operative after a Medium post in which he praised Russia and its president Vladimir Putin. 4 days after Brett Kavanaugh was accused of assault, The Guardian reports that Christine Ford's life has been, quote, turned upside down by her accusation, noting that she has received threats. As you can imagine, Kavanaugh, his family, and Republicans had also received threats, but that was not covered. 4 days after Biden was accused, The Guardian said, quote, "It's hugely frustrating to see conservatives who couldn't give a damn about the multiple sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump weaponize the accusations against Biden. However, it's also frustrating to see so many liberals turning a blind eye. The accusations against the former vice president are serious. Why aren't they being taken seriously?" And while it's appreciated that The Guardian is willing to admit that it's frustrating seeing so many liberals turning a blind eye, it doesn't change the fact that it took over a month for a publication to corroborate the allegations that Tara Reid was making. So, and it wasn't even The Guardian. So at the same time they're lamenting that so many liberals are turning a blind eye, they are also not pursuing the story themselves despite being a news outlet. And I want to address the first part of The Guardian's statement as well. Quote, "It's hugely frustrating to see conservatives who couldn't give a damn about the multiple sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump weaponize the accusations against Biden." Now, I think I might be a bit rambly, but I'm going to try to edit it to be cohesive, so just bear with me. I've seen this point repeated a lot online, and I don't really understand it because it seems that the conservative perspective on this has been to look at each case on its individual merits, while the Democrat perspective, and more specifically Joe Biden's, if we could just scroll up a little bit, Joe Biden's perspective on the issue was that, 2 days after Brett Kavanaugh had been accused, Joe Biden said women's claims of sexual assault should be presumed to be true. So this idea that, there's some weaponization of the accusations against Biden, it's not weaponizing the accusations against Biden. It's weaponizing Biden against Biden, essentially. It's weaponizing his standard against him. And the issue with a standard is that if you're going to apply it to others, you have to apply it to yourself. I also don't think it's fair to categorize conservatives as just not giving a damn about multiple sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump. The reality is, an allegation is just that. And so we have to look at each case individually and determine whether or not we believe the events did or did not occur. I find it interesting that all the time we hear about the multiple sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump instead of just one or two that are the most damning. It has to be this blanket thing that is basically unnamed. It's just multiple sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump. Well, who are they? What are they accusing him of specifically? What is the situation surrounding the events occurring? These are questions that need to be asked, and they're very relevant when determining whether or not somebody actually did something. Speaking of determining whether or not somebody did something, I think one of the least appreciated parts of the Kavanaugh saga was the fact that there is no evidence that Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh ever even met. So he is being accused of sexually assaulting someone who it's very possible he has never even been in the same room as. Now, I'm not saying that they have never met, but the thing about it is you can't prove a negative. I can't prove that somebody never met somebody else. And the whole thing is there is no evidence to the affirmative, as in there is no evidence that this person met this other person. There is no evidence that Christine Blasey Ford and Brett Kavanaugh interacted in any way. And yet, in the days following her allegation, media picked up and amplified the story. They gave her a mouthpiece to essentially ruin a man's life. There's a distinct possibility that the two of them have never been in a room together. In the case of Joe Biden, there is ample evidence that Tara Reade and Joe Biden met, because Tara Reade was a staffer, and while I started this video with that cute clip of Joe Biden falling asleep, you have to remember that Joe Biden was once himself a young man, a young, powerful senator who is alleged to have taken advantage of a staffer. So the timeline picks back up again 12 days after the Brett Kavanaugh allegations, but that's actually not where I would have picked it back up. I would have gone 8 days later when The Guardian, which was so upset that liberals were not taking Joe Biden's allegations seriously enough, 8 days after Brett Kavanaugh was accused of sexual assault by somebody that has no corroborating evidence that had ever met, 8 days later, The Guardian reports that a third woman accuses Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault, except this woman accuses him of being involved in some sort of gang rape ring. So we have gone from sexual assault to gang rape ring allegations in mainstream media for Brett Kavanaugh in less than 10 days. And seeing as the Fox News timeline wasn't as thorough as I'd hoped, I went to Wikipedia to see who followed up with these allegations. So, Julie Swetnick, a third allegation of sexual assault against Kavanaugh, was announced by Michael Avenatti, currently in jail, the lawyer for a third woman, on September 23rd in The Guardian. On September 26th, the woman, Julie Swetnick, released a sworn statement alleging that she had witnessed Kavanaugh and Mark Judge trying to get teenage girls inebriated and disoriented so they could then be gang raped in a side room or a bedroom by a train of numerous boys. Swetnick also alleged Kavanaugh and Judge were both present when she was victim of such a gang rape. The Wall Street Journal contacted dozens of her former classmates and colleagues, but couldn't reach anyone with knowledge of her allegations, and none of her friends have come forward to publicly support her claims. So the Wall Street Journal, after this is reported, follows up swiftly with as many classmates and colleagues as they can, and they uncover nothing. So in less than 10 days, the mainstream media, including institutions like the Washington Post, have pursued Brett Kavanaugh allegations to every possible end that all their resources could muster, and they were still able to uncover nothing. And when Lindsey Graham erupts in the Senate, as you can see, CNN picking a very flattering image. And hey, when people say fake news, it's not just about telling lies, blatant lies. It's about what you report. It's about how you report. It's about the pictures you put up. Stuff like this. New York Times describes Kavanaugh and Graham's behavior as a typical display of white male anger, again after this man had been accused of being a gang rapist by people who not have been corroborated to have met this person, despite the media's best efforts to research and uncover that information. Meanwhile, 12 days after Joe Biden is accused of sexual assault, CNN and the New York Times have yet to mention the story at all. 18 days after Brett Kavanaugh has been accused of sexual assault and being a gang rapist, Christine Blasey Ford's lifelong friend and the supposed witness at the party in which Kavanaugh is alleged to have assaulted Ford doesn't back Ford's account, and later would say that much of Ford's account didn't make any sense, including how Ford couldn't remember how she got home from the party. Just to reiterate, this is at the end of the media's best efforts to investigate and uncover dirt on this person to hopefully ruin their life. And finally, 18 days after Joe Biden is accused of sexual assault, the New York Times finally covers Reid's accusations, and in the article makes sure to note that Reid could face criminal penalties for filing a false police report. And when the Times attempted to explain why they took longer than 2 weeks to report on this, the Times executive editor, Dean Beckett, said, Kavanaugh was already in a public forum in a large way. Let's just take a second to appreciate that. Obviously, it's nonsense to suggest that the person who is the presumptive nominee for one of the two major political parties for the presidency is in a public forum in a large way. And not only that, but you have the fact that the New York Times is the public forum that they're talking about. They're basically saying that, well, we were reporting on Kavanaugh, and therefore it is legitimate to report on Kavanaugh. But of course, they've also been reporting on Joe Biden, and it's utter nonsense. And I just want to say this, if you take these organizations seriously and you read an article from them and think that is the truth, you are clearly being suckered. When the New York Times actually tweeted about the allegations, they were contacted by the Biden campaign and were asked to change the wording of their coverage. So the New York Times was receptive to a political candidate requesting that they change the way that they're covering a story because it was unfavorable to them. And here is the statement before they edited it. No other allegations about sexual assault surfaced in the course of our reporting, nor did any former Biden staff corroborate Reid's allegation. We found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable. Now, a pattern of hugs, kisses, and touches that makes women uncomfortable would, to most people, sound like some sort of misconduct at minimum, and perhaps maybe demonstrate a pattern, but to the big brains at the New York Times, no, it doesn't. And finally, 18 days later, the Washington Post also covers Tara Reid's claims for the first time. At this point, they had broken the accusations against Kavanaugh and had also followed up with an investigation into any known colleagues and associates to find any extra dirt on him, and when accusations that he may have been a member of a gang rape ring came up, they also pressed those allegations. Meanwhile, it took them 18 days to even acknowledge that Joe Biden had been accused of anything. And I'm going to stop here because I think my point's been demonstrated. The bias is obvious, and when somebody says fake news, like I mentioned earlier, it's not just about publishing false information. It's really about what you publish, when you publish, how you publish, what you say. In a matter of 10 days, the media apparatus was able to amplify this story of Christine Blasey Ford, and ended up spiraling out of control to the point where Brett Kavanaugh was accused of being a member of a gang rape ring. Not only that, but these institutions, specifically the Washington Post, used their resources to investigate and uncover the truth and found no evidence that any of this had occurred. Meanwhile, in the case of Joe Biden, not only did they not investigate, but they refused to cover the story for nearly 20 days. And even when they finally begrudgingly are willing to admit it, do so in a way that obfuscates what's going on. So I've been saying the media as a pretty blanket term, and I kind of want to clarify what I mean by it right now. I'm really specifically referring to the Washington Post and the New York Times. I'm not great on journalistic practices, but it's my understanding that these publications are where a lot of news originates. So while a lot of news in the modern comes from, everyday reporters on Twitter, everybody has a cell phone these days and can be, the news basically themselves. A lot of the insider scoops, so if you work in the White House and you want to get in contact with a reporter to tell your story, or to basically leak information, that goes through these publications. There's a reason the Washington Post and the New York Times you have to pay a subscription for. Meanwhile, like CNN and The Hill are free. It's because they have something that those other publications don't. And so they have a great deal of control on what narratives the media is covering at any given time. So for example, in this case, you notice that none of the other publications really pick up on it, but after the New York Times and the Washington Post picked up on it, 20 days later, we've started to see it become more mainstream. Again, today is the 29th of April, and these accusations came out over a month ago against the presumptive nominee, Democratic Party for the President of the United States, and these allegations that he was accused of sexual assault by somebody who we know that he actually met and was in the same room with were not covered for nearly 20 days. Again, even the article says ABC and CBS News, among other networks, mention Reed's allegations claims shortly afterwards, also for the first time. So as soon as the Washington Post and the New York Times basically put their stamp of approval, these other, the alphabet soup networks, if you will, are more willing to cover the story. And for the layman, it's, again, why does it matter that it's these organizations versus that organization? Well, as, this story has kind of highlighted, these other publications follow the lead of the New York Times and the Washington Post. So when the New York Times and the Washington Post refuse to cover a story, other outlets also refuse to cover that story, despite the story being undoubtedly newsworthy. The last point I want to make is on messaging regarding this. I've seen a lot of people online basically saying, oh, the media is covering for Joe Biden. And that is, while undoubtedly true, I don't think it elicits the visceral response that will actually make people question why exactly it's a bad thing that media outlets are capitulating when presidential campaigns request that they change information. Or why is it a bad thing when the media isn't investigating prominent senators and presidential nominees. And it's that the media isn't protecting Joe Biden. The media is protecting a powerful senator. The media is protecting a presidential candidate. And I think that type of verbiage is better at actually eliciting the feeling of corruption that is so interwoven with that. How is it that these media institutions, which are supposed to speak truth to power, are unwilling to be combative with a presidential nominee who has clear mental decline, who is under allegations of sexual assault? These institutions need trust in order for them to function, and clearly they aren't earning that. But why aren't they earning that? The reason is because they don't speak truth to power, and they aren't interested in actually combating the status quo.